So I was going to live stream this, but basically YouTube won't let me. So I'm going to do a video and upload it. This is reading Rehabilitate Rewire Recover, and we're on page 80, I think. And I guess this chapter, it's all about fear, and it's the end of this chapter. Well, I might be lying if I say that. No, it's definitely the end of this chapter. And it's actually page 79 I'm going to start with. And the heading here is the insula. The insula has to balance out the parts of the brain that deal with the external environment and those responsible for maintaining homeostasis. Its connections in the brain are vast. It's easier to list the parts of the brain that the insula is not connected with those that it is. It's like Waterloo Station in London, connected to everywhere. It's a communication hub. Anyway, the insula is relevant in your body representation and your perception of self. That is, the way that you think of your body. It works with the other brain areas such as the somatosensory cortex involved in perception of self. In doing this, the insula stores up an integrated model of your own body. It's a bit like Google Maps in that sense. It's usually thought that people with anorexia, a faulty representation is given what makes a person perceive their body as different, bigger than it really is. And this theory is behind body dysmorphia. Not every person with anorexia is the same level of body dysmorphia, but most of us have some form or of major or minor incongruence between the way that we are and the way that we think we are. For some reason, as I was nutritionally rehabilitating, I actually found it comforting to know that my perception of self was out of whack. It calmed me to think that my perception is skewed and the things that I was feeling were inaccurate. So my thoughts on that now is that actually a lot of the reasons that our perception of how we look is not quite as it should be when we have an eating disorder. Even those of us like myself that don't actually have, like, we understand that we're underweight. We might not even like it. We might know that we look like crap, but not to the extent that we actually do look like crap, if that makes sense. I think it's mostly to do with fear of weight gain again. I think that fear influences our perception. And if your brain is afraid of something happening, your brain's afraid of you gaining weight, then your brain can intercept with your perception of yourself and make you feel like you are larger than you are as a way to quite cleverly, quite cunningly cause you not to feel the urgency that you should do about gaining weight. All right, so we're on to chapter 5, and this says effects of malnutrition - starvation. This chapter will explore the effects of long-term malnutrition. You may have seen or experienced many of these issues outlined in the following pages, but you may not have considered them to be natural responses to energy deficit and malnutrition. There are significant things that happen when a person goes without enough food. Frankly, the more I learn about how brilliant the human body is, the more in awe I am of it. I'm thankful that it did its job and kept me alive despite the constant strain it was under due to lack of food. How energy deficit affects your metabolism. That's a header. Let's get one thing clear. You cannot break your metabolism. Your metabolism is not a china vase. When your metabolism reacts to energy deficit by slowing down, it's not broken. It's actually doing its job of conserving energy in times of energy scarcity perfectly. Your metabolism is reactive. It responds to a combination of external and internal environmental data it's given. If that is an environment that creates energy deficit, it will slow in response. If it's an environment of energy surplus, it will speed in response. Your body is really flipping smart. I mean, it really is, isn't it? It's just like a massive, big, interactive algorithm that learns, but better. Anyway, during initial calorie restriction, you go into energy deficit, which means that you are expending more energy than you're taking in. In this initial phase, you may lose weight pretty fast. The second phase is when your rate of weight loss decreases. It will continue until fat mass is depleted. After this, if energy deficit continues, your body starts to metabolize your protein stores. Metabolic rate decreases is the next title. As you eat less and your body weight falls, your body reduces your metabolic rate in order to run more efficiently. It's rather like the way that you would make an effort to spend less money if you got a pay cut. You fire the maid and the butler, sell the horses, not to live in a one-bed apartment rather than your mansion in the countryside, right? The human brain is expensive to run and is said to require around 25% of the energy we consume. Oh, it's quite a lot, isn't it? It's all that thinking. Anyway, as malnutrition continues, the prefrontal cortex and higher brain or executive functioning areas get less fuel. It's not good. Doesn't sound good. There are a number of ways in which your body economizes. One of which is slowing down movement of food through your intestines or delaying gastric emptying. This makes sense really if the production line of food going through your body is low. You don't need a conveyor belt that's running at the rate of knots. Better to save energy while there's not much food coming in by slowing that whole digestion operation down. You know, I find it funny that we say at the rate of knots when actually a knot is quite slow. Anyway, it's just a saying. Don't read anything into that. Your endocrine system has various ways that it economizes, such as decreasing thyroid hormones, insulin, testosterone, and leptin, and increasing levels of cortisol and ghrelin. All in all, this results in decreased heat production, hence you feel cold a lot, and reduction of your overall metabolic rate. The implications here for the thyroid hormones are intense and can lead to hypothyroidism, such as slow heart rate, bradycardia, hypothermia, and ultimately the thyroid can shrink in size. Many of the hormones that control appetite are affected, and this contributes to the illness by making us feel less hungry. I don't think I got that bit. I was really hungry when I had an eating disorder. I was also really fucking cold. I definitely got that bit. It was noted by Ansel Keys that food restriction results in a very considerable set of adaptations by the human body. However, miraculously, the life of the organism is maintained closer to normal than we thought possible. Oh, this is a quote from Ansel Keys, I guess. Man, therefore, can achieve not inconsiderable adaptation to the caloric restriction. The manner in which the adaptation is achieved, however, is in part quite different from the way in which the body adapts to such stresses such as high altitude exposure, heart disease, or an increase in the environmental temperature. It is clear that much of the adaptation is an automatic consequence of the use of the body itself as fuel for metabolism. The life of the organism is prolonged or maintained closer than normal than would otherwise be the case by the rather desperate expedient of reducing the mass activity of the organism. So basically, he's saying it's quite miraculous that your body can kind of function seemingly normally, but it's actually behind the scenes paddling a lot, you know. Most of the time, you have no idea how much distress your body is actually in. Whilst all these things are going on inside my body, I had little knowledge of them. I was so fixated on restriction and exercise that I thought of little else. I was simultaneously self-absorbed and alarmingly unaware of myself. This makes it even more scary in a way, as it enabled me to keep going despite being in a state of malnutrition. We kid ourselves that it's okay, because it feels okay, but we're not. And I think that's one of the hardest things. And that's why people talk about anosognosia so much with people with eating disorders, is that we kind of feel okay. And sometimes we actually feel quite good. And we're not good, but we feel good. And that just makes it all confusing and further aids us thinking, no, I'm fine. All these people telling me that I need to eat more and rest, they're all a bunch of lunatics. I'm fine. At least I certainly felt like that a lot. If this is in bold, so it must be important. If anorexia is a survival adaptation to a famine environment, why is the malnutrition it creates so very bad for us? Surely this is maladaptive. Well, I imagine that if it were for migration processes, then anorexia's urges to move a lot and eat very little would serve to get you where the abundant food was. Then, when abundant food was met and feasting began, that was signal to the body that the migration response should be switched off. An end point. In the modern world where energy deficit is instigated not for reasons of food scarcity, there is no natural shut-off point. The state of malnutrition go on for years and cause serious damage to even death. So I hope what you're getting at there is, I mentioned it, I think, in an earlier chapter, that it wasn't supposed to go on like this. If anorexia did start off being a sort of migration, adaptively famine, as Shan Geisinger puts it, response, then it would have been quite short-lived, because you use it to migrate, and then when you get to where you're going, everybody would stuff their faces and it would switch off. And I certainly think I felt that in the first couple of months when my eating disorder was starting, that I think was, I hadn't reached the point of no return. I could have turned back, but I didn't, and it went on for years and years and years. But I think that if it was a migration response, then we wouldn't have ever you wouldn't get to the point of no return, right? Because you'd find where you were migrating to and you'd be fine. Malnutrition is stressful. That's a header. A starving animal is paranoid, irritable, hyper alert, mean, defensive, possessive. What does a starving animal do with food it can't eat? It hoards it, steals it. Many of us with anorexia start hoarding food and other resources, are unable to spend money or even allow ourselves to wear our good clothes out for fear of ruining them. Oh my God, I did that so much when I had an eating disorder. Like, I had these clothes that I would never let myself wear. They were like my good clothes that I was saving for best, but I never fucking went anywhere, did I? Because all I did was work and exercise. So there wasn't any best coming up. Anyway, here comes a quote from BJ. I had this leather jacket in my wardrobe. I'd never worn it. Instead, I continued to wear the scrappy old jacket I bought it to replace. I never used to be weird about wearing new clothes before anorexia. It's the same, apart from, with me, it was trainers. And I did a lot of running, right? So my trainers would start to look beaten, the amount of steps they damn well took. And I would run in all weathers as well. So they were getting wet all the time. And yeah, they looked trashed. And I would buy a new pair of trainers, but then I would continue to wear the old beaten up ones for like years. Like years. I don't do that. No, I'm quite happy to wear whatever. If I buy something new, I start wearing it. So that's nice, isn't it? Anyway, next paragraph. My hungry brain was preoccupied with food and directed all my sensory energy towards finding potential food sources, smelling and tasting food. Hence, in combination with anorexia, which inhibits actual eating, I developed all manner of odd behaviours, such as cookbook obsessions, grocery store frequenting without buying, and tasting food before spitting it out. I didn't know at the time, but cookbook porn, an obsession with cooking programs, and a tendency to nibble at or smell foods when nobody's looking are all very common in anorexia. Mental hunger. The malnourished brain is also pretty wary of change and anxious about the future, be it 5 minutes or 5 years along the line. For people with long-term anorexia, it can actually work to make us fearful of the change that recovery may bring. For all of us, it looks like inflexibility. For some of us, we don't like going on vacation. We don't like things like holidays or anything that's a change from the normal day. We future trip and allow the what-ifs to put us off taking action. Hesitation to change means that we get deeper and deeper into our energy deficit as we cannot think clearly, and the cycle continues. Certainly happened with me. I get to the point where I was so tired and I was so sick of myself and my daily routine that I was so attached to that also made me crazy and I hated it. Yet I was more afraid of changing it for a long time, or I'd think about changing it and then that would feel scary. And talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place, because you're either stuck doing your shit eating disorder stuff or you're scared of changing your shit eating disorder stuff. Next paragraph. In short, for many of us, the combined effects of starvation and the anorexia response elicit a shift in character. Over the years, I assumed that this anxious and stressed out personality was me, but thankfully it wasn't. I returned to being a carefree, happy, relaxed person when my brain and body came out of malnutrition. This happens when we come into energy balance and stay there for a prolonged period of time. You know what? The thing I don't mention there is a happy person. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I was a happy person. Even as a grumpy teenager, I was a happy person. You know, I had fun, I had friends. Most part, I just sort of did what I wanted. And I didn't overthink things, and I wasn't oversensitive, and just happy. And when I had an eating disorder, I was the opposite of all of that. I would not describe myself as a happy person. I don't think anybody who knew me would have described me as a happy person. Sure, I had times when I was happy, but they still felt different somehow, like I knew it wasn't going to last type of happy. Whereas I would now describe myself as once again a happy person. That does not mean that shit stuff doesn't happen to me. It does. Like I told you guys last week, I had to put a horse through colic surgery on Tuesday night, almost a week ago now, and he almost died. Sort of 3 times. He almost died in the hospital. Thankfully, he came home Sunday night. So that was a bit of a shit time, but... So that happened Tuesday. But it feels like, you know, now if something bad happens, The bad thing that happened is the isolated thing, and I can be sad about that happening, but also still be a happy person. Whereas before, when I had an eating disorder, it was like being unhappy, an unhappy person was the normal. And even when something good happened, it's like that felt like this isolated thing that wasn't going to last. So it's a little bit reversed. It's better now. Ooh, next chapter is about Minnesota starvation experiment. The effects of malnutrition were documented quite nicely a long while ago in the Minnesota starvation experiment. To summarise, for those of you that have not read the study, it was a clinical analysis performed in Minnesota between November 19th, 1944 and December 20th, 1945 by a bloke called Ansel Keys. Keys wanted to see what happens when people are not given enough food and how quickly or not humans can recover from malnutrition. After a control period on a normal diet of 3,200 calories, the 36 male participants in that study were put on a short-term starvation diet, and that was about 1,570 calories for 6 months. With their weight loss, they began to display all sorts of out-of-character behaviours. And here is in brackets. Notice that this normal amount of 3,200 calories that the men were fed in the control period is now, in our diet obsessed culture, considered over the recommended caloric requirements for the average person. I would argue that recommended caloric restriction across the board, as many health bodies have done, has only contributed to the many health problems, physical and mental, today. But that's a whole other book. In the semi-starvation part of the experiment, the men reported feeling irritable with one another and family. They were paranoid, they hoarded food, they obsessed about food. They displayed many of the traits that are typical of anorexia, yet they did not have anorexia. From this, we can see that many of these traits associated with anorexia are in fact due to the effects of starvation. And the good news is that they are reversible with nutritional rehabilitation. The next heading is food, period, water, period, oxygen, period. If any of these basic needs are not met, life would be put in jeopardy. That's a NASA fact sheet. There are 3 substances that every human needs in order to live: food, water, and oxygen. This is another reason why it's so preposterous to me that talk therapy for anorexia often focuses on a person's relationship with others and ability to love oneself. A person who is missing enough of a vital human survival element such as food doesn't need to talk about love, they need to eat. This is a quote. You've got oxygen and water, and food would be your 3rd most pressing need. It's pretty remarkable to think that people would be psychologically just overcoming that innate drive to eat. That's pretty shocking, really. And that is a quote from Michael Lutter, who's a psychiatrist and researcher on eating disorder genetics. I've included that on there because a lot of the time people think that people with eating disorders have just got this fucking amazing willpower and they're just being stubborn and deciding not to eat. And if you think about it, like he's just put, that's pretty remarkable. To think that you'd be able to override the innate desire to eat just because you felt like it. Oh, I say something about this next. The above statement is from a conversation that I had with researcher Michael Lutter the week after he published the research study, novel on ultra-rare damaging variants in neuropeptide signaling are associated with disordered eating behaviours. Do you know what? I don't remember this conversation at all. Anyway, continuing on. It's not just shocking, it's ludicrous that for decades it's been thought that people with restrictive eating disorders will override all feelings of hunger and starve themselves to death on a whim. I imagine that is someone that I interviewed for a podcast, and it's probably in my podcast archives. Maybe I should listen, because apparently I don't remember anything. Incidentally, the above study is among only a few that have looked into linking neurotransmitters involved in feeding and appetite to eating disorders. Lutter told me that what seems rather an obvious finding, that the neurotransmitters that govern feeding behaviour are disrupted in people with eating disorders, hadn't been found before because nobody looked for it. The field of research has been so focused on looking for psychological reasons behind anorexia and other eating disorders that the most blatant biological connections are only just being explored. So that is interesting, and you learn something new every day, even if it's something that I knew before and I've written about, but just forgot because I'm so obsessed with horses now I don't think about this shit anymore. But it turns out that those neurotransmitters are different, the ones that govern feeding behaviour. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we don't feel hungry. We do. All right, this is a big chapter heading, effects of malnutrition, ones you may notice in yourself. Malnutrition has to be treated as a serious, life-threatening medical emergency. Here are some of the most commonly observed effects. Of course, there are more, And there are things specific to you that I may not have noted. Additionally, don't expect to have all of these effects. Not having them doesn't mean that you're not in malnutrition. We're all different. Sensitivity to noise, crowds, etc. Many of us find we develop a hyper-awareness of our environment when we are in malnutrition. Disliking the sound of other people eating or breathing is common. I hated being in crowded public spaces, but it was more the noise that got to me than anything else. I also developed a strong intolerance to the sound of road traffic or other forms of white noise. This effect reduced with recovery. I still don't love noise, but my aversion to it is not nearly as strong as when I was in energy deficit. It doesn't get under my skin and make me fractious like it used to. I've heard some people become very sensitive to the smell of cooking when they have anorexia. This is a quote. I had an extra extraction fan fitted into the kitchen because I hate cooking smells. That was RB, who was an adult in recovery. Many people with anorexia have told me that they could not abide to hear other people eating. I don't remember this being a thing for me, but frankly it's probably because I was so isolated all the time I rarely had anyone else to eat with anyway. But in case you have noticed this about yourself, yes, it's a fairly normal anorexia trait and your sensitivity to noise should reduce as you recover. Here's another quote. Even listening to my kids eating annoys me, makes me feel like a bad mother. And that was EJ, who was an adult in recovery. Edema. I'm going to finish by reading this chapter. Swelling is most common in the ankles, feet, under the chin, cheeks, and around the eyes. I've known plenty of clients who experience swelling in their legs and arms. This can happen during restriction or during phases of recovery. With refeeding, edema and general swelling is common. This can be painful and is awkward at the best of times. Here is something I learned about edema from Jennifer Gaudiani. Edema can actually be due to an overcompensation towards dehydration by the body. The way I understand it, and in non-doctor speak, is that if you've been purging via vomiting or laxative use, etc., then sometimes the edema can be extensive. Because when you purge, your body gets massively dehydrated and low in salt. To guard against losing more water and salt, a hormone called aldosterone gets produced. This hormone stops you losing as much salt and water in your pee. When you stop purging and start to rehydrate, overproduction of aldosterone in your body can lead to the huge water retention that some people see. This is usually short-lived, but if it goes on too long, it is not optimal and there are medications that you can take to reduce it. If your medical doctor is not savvy to these effects of purging, then ask them to look into high production of aldosterone. It's something called pseudo-Batra syndrome. Batra syndrome. This is a quote. My legs are swollen and painful. I'm tired. I feel like 10 years of exercise just caught up with me. Any significant throbbing, discoloration, or dizziness should be presented to a medical professional for observation. Now, I know in there that I wrote, and this was my conversation with Dr. Gaudiani, and it was specifically, she talked about that aldosterone production in edema related to purging. People with long-term history of purging. In my experience as a coach, I have seen people with excessive edema that have no history of purging. I always encourage people to go and speak to their doctor and ask about that aldosterone production test, just to rule that out. Edema should not be like long lasting and super painful. Like I say often in books, blogs, things like that, like edema is normal in recovery, and it is, but it should be relatively short lived and it shouldn't be like massively excessive and it shouldn't be painful. If it's any of those things, you want to go and get checked out by a medical doctor. Okay, so apologies again that this was not live. It's YouTube's fault, not mine. I tried 5 times to get a live stream going. And every time I tried, it would be like, all right, live stream. And then it would go, you're live. And then it would just be like, oh, sorry, we can't do this right now. Something went wrong. I was like, God, YouTube. I mean, it is free after all, though. I don't think I pay for it, do I? So can't really complain that much. For those of you that know about or following me on social media, you know that my horse Arthur, like I said, was in surgery. He's doing quite well. It's a long rehab for him now. He has to be on box rest for about 3 months, which is not how I usually look after horses. But I suppose anything, including a person that's undergone major surgery, it's the same as being on bed rest, I guess. You don't put a horse on bed rest, you put it on box rest. So he's a little bit fed up. Same as I would be if I was on bed rest. You'd just be fed up, wouldn't you? but he's alive, and so far so good. And that little foal that I updated the pictures of that Jade had about a week ago now is doing very well. Doesn't, you know, I spoke about it a bit in the video, how life is just full of ups and downs, isn't it? It's just full of ups and downs. But my brain processes the ups and downs differently now than it did when I had an eating disorder. When I had an eating disorder, it's almost like my brain just saw the downs, or that was my natural state of being, was just negative about the world and unhappy. And good things could happen, but the good thing would happen, and it's almost like I would be like, I feel happy that this happened, but my underlying state was still an unhappy person. Whereas now, bad things can happen, and I can be like, that's shit that happened. But my underlying state is that of a happy person, which makes everything, even the bad things that happen in life, it just makes it better. And I think it's so important to be able, especially when you're having a tough time with something, it's important to still be able to be happy despite that. And that was absolutely something I was incapable of when I had an eating disorder. Anyhow, well, hopefully I'll be doing a live on Friday. I guess it depends how YouTube feels. In the meantime,